You'll know which one maybe. So this is kind of a long title, but I don't know how many of you guys were at the keynote this morning with Undersecretary Bonnie, and I think he did a great job of weaving the themes of both economic benefits and incentives to stakeholders like land managers and ranchers, but also the resilience of our landscapes for future use. And so with that context, I think this particular work, for today at least, can be used to help assess those co-benefits. That is, under different grazing management practices and or potential climate change, how can we ensure the economic viability of working landowners, but also the long-term sustainability of their land? And so the first question, what are rangelands? And so my background is actually in civil engineering, and when I started doing this work, I'm an engineer pretending to be an ecologist. I said, what are rangelands? What are grasslands? And so I found out that there are actually a lot of definitions, over 300 actually. But you can define rangelands in different ways. By vegetation, so the presence of grasses, grass-like species, forbs or shrubs, and basically a low abundance of woody vegetation. And where you see that transition between grasslands and vegetation, we call savannas. You can also define them by climate. They're mostly located in semi-arid to arid regions. And for their land use, they're mostly managed. And there's also a continuum of management, of course. And you can go from none or to extensive, which are more natural grasslands, to very frequent or intensive. And some of the examples of management can include, of course, livestock grazing, which I will focus on today. Fencing, supplemental feeding, and then management of wildlife and or brush and or weeds. And so here are just some pictures of rangelands in case you don't know what they look like. So as I mentioned, some of them can be more shrubby and semi-arid. Some can be actually in lush areas, but then they are still managed. Some, again, down here, they're more lush and green, maybe not what you're used to looking at. And here is actually a rangeland by Spokane, so not too far from here, from a rancher who we've spoken to, one of our stakeholders, and this was from March of 2014, I think. So not too green yet. And again, with the definitions, there are many definitions, so not only in terms of climate and vegetation, but also the different agencies have different definitions. Some have common definitions, so vegetation for the USDA Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, and also the NRCS. They consider, grasses, grass-like species, forb shrubs, great. But BLM and NRCS go on to also talk about natural grasslands, savannas, shrublands, deserts, tundra, etc., and they go more specifics. They also talk about introduced plant or forage species. And again, there's management, and so they have interesting definitions like it's like native vegetation or it's like rangeland. But the NRCS goes on to talk more specifically about the types of management that can occur on rangeland, such as deferred grazing, burning, chaining, rotational grazing, with little or no chemicals or fertilizer. That's an interesting way to define rangelands because they also define pasture lands separately from rangelands. And finally, land use. Rangelands can be considered a land use and or land cover, but only the NRCS considers it a land cover or land use category explicitly in its definition. And so here's a map of the spatial extent of rangelands, again using one definition of rangelands. And this is from a paper from Reeves and Mitchell, 2011, in Rangeland Ecology Management. And they're using a definition from the Forest Inventory Analysis, the FIA land fire model. And they found in this yellow, so the rangelands are in this yellow. Green are forested and woody areas, and then blue is water. And they found around 25% of the lower 48 states make up rangeland. Another model they used, they found makes up around 35% of the US is rangeland. And so you have a range from 25 to 35%. And the USDA Economic Research Services actually confers this estimate around 25% of the lower 48 is around 25% grassland, rangeland, and shrublands. And so why are rangelands important? So they provide a variety of tangible and intangible ecological services and goods. One is habitat. And so this is actually a picture that I took on a mini vacation, I guess, to Yellowstone National Park, so bison grazing on some grass. I promised I was doing work, Jenny, but and so they provide essential habitat for wildlife, but also for grazers. And there's also forage, so it's eating grass. There's also potential for carbon storage in grasslands. Another type of ecological service, or why it's important, is agricultural. And so the grazing livestock can provide essential protein products to feed a growing human population. And finally, there are social and cultural things that are important about rangelands. They provide recreation. They also provide, vistas. Rangelands are beautiful. You can go out and take pictures and see all the beautiful grazers out here. Who wouldn't want to take pictures of that? And so now I'm going to talk about rangelands as a resource. And so I found this interesting document from a 1965 publication from the USDA. It's called the Soil and Water Conservation Needs. It's pretty old, but yet they still scanned a copy, which is nice for me. And so I'd like to read you a snippet from that manual. They say that farmers and ranchers must realize the importance of the management and cultural practices needed to keep their grassland productive and to furnish quality forage throughout the grazing season. They also go on to say that grassland is the most neglected part of many farms and ranches, yet on many it can be made to produce more net income per acre than many other crops. So back in 1965, they were talking about what we're talking about today, that how do we keep our grassland productive in terms of economic values, but also environmental. And so we jump to today, the USDA NRCS 2011 Manual Conservation Benefits of Rangeland Practices, and they say conservation programs must evaluate the potential trade-offs between agricultural production and the maintenance of ecosystem services. So this goes back to what Undersecretary Bonnie's talked about, this trade-off between economic and environmental co-benefits. And so as I mentioned, there's this balancing of multiple objectives. And so you can look at forage quality and quantity, or productivity or landscape. So you can look at the environmental part for wildlife, of course, but then also for your livestock. How much livestock am I going to put on this landscape? But I need to consider if I can use this land for next year. We can also look at the stocking rate, another type of objective. And the stocking rate is the number of livestock per unit area. And so you can look at the profit you can make off of that, or the negative rangeland impacts you can have putting too many cows on a certain plot of land. And finally, you can look at your type of grazing system. So how do you graze the landscape? You can have rotational, where you rotate a different piece of land, you graze that, and you move on to another piece of land. Or you can have continuous, where you graze one piece of land for the entire season. And another advantage or disadvantage of using grazing system is that you can have a seasonal adjustment to weather. So depending on your system, you can easily adjust depending on your previous month's weather, what you predict for next month. Alternatively, you can also use grazing systems to decide whether you need to have supplemental feed or not. And of course, that's another economic and environmental trade-off that ranchers would need to consider. And so with all of these, we have challenges and opportunities. And so I'm a modeler, and so the challenge for me is how do we develop models that are useful for land managers and ranchers and also decision makers, and not only developing models, but we talk about producing output that is useful for them. So what are those decision variables that they're looking at? How do we incorporate those into the model? And then what's the output that's useful for you? And so there are opportunities with that challenge. We can incorporate spatial and temporal variability from past and future climate into our models. We can improve how they're accessed, their consistency, and also the understandability of these complex rangeland models. And finally, we can also integrate experimental and experiential knowledge. So when I go out to Cheney and talk to the rancher there, I can talk to him about what does he see on the landscape, and does that translate into the mechanistic processes in our model. And so the research objectives here, the first is to really investigate how grass biomass responds to the interacting effects of climate and management. And when I talk about climate, I'm just primarily looking at precipitation and temperature. And for management, I'm looking at grazing and grazing intensity. And so specifically, we produce response curves to decision variables of grazing management. So intensity, which is how much biomass is removed from the landscape, the start date of grazing, so your stocking date, and your end date, which is your destocking date. When do I remove the cows from the landscape? And finally, as I mentioned, looking at simple climate perturbations, temperature, and precipitation. And so I didn't think there were going to be a lot of modeling talks in this session, actually. So I don't know if I have to talk about what are models, but I consider three general types of modeling approaches, especially when you're going from data to management. You can have more of this expert opinion or rules of thumb where you can say usually we do this because we've seen this, and that is seen in more institutional knowledge and or legacy information. My grandfather did this, so I'm going to do this. Another type of model could be more extrapolation, where you have what you've observed and you extrapolate out into the future. So relationships based on past observations. But then what I think is the most powerful but also complex and requires a lot of parameterization is the process-based models, which incorporate fundamental mechanisms but also you can also do uncertainty analysis. And so for this, I use the Reyes model, which is the regional regional hydroecologic simulation system. And with this model, we can simulate the interaction of hydrology and ecology. We can look at carbon and nitrogen water cycling. And in addition to that, we can look at these competing effects instead of using these best management practices and/or these extrapolative models. And with this model, you can also look at photosynthesis. You can look at impacts of plant mortality. You can look at litter fall, and there is a dynamic vegetation model. So it takes some algorithms from the biome BGC model, which was talked about earlier. And it does take into account the characteristics of the watershed, meaning you can look at topography, the effects of topography, as well as linking climate and soil and vegetation characteristics, producing unique patches that can interact with each other on the landscape. And so for this study, I looked at a combination of climate and land use, determining which sites to look at. And so I used the National Land Cover data set, and I just selected grassland, shrublands, that particular niche, and I combined it with the Köppen-Geiger climate classifications to determine which of those climate classifications fall in grasslands and rangelands. And unfortunately, I did not select one in the Pacific Northwest for now. I chose one in Northeast Colorado, actually at the Shortgrass Steppe long-term ecological research site, which has a lot of data for me to use in terms of evaluating and calibrating my model. And so right here. But the sites that we did choose, eventually 7 of them, do match these general rangeland biomes from an old study from 1978 where they did look at these different rangeland biomes. And so as I mentioned very quickly, the modeling process, we look at these decision variables: grazing intensity, stocking date, destocking date, and the response variables of biomass, above ground and below ground. And then we also look at precipitation and temperature. And there are some simulation details. I won't talk about that now so we can get to some results, but if you have questions, we can talk about those. And so first we can look at grazing effects on biomass. And so the solid lines represent below ground biomass, and then the dotted lines represent above ground biomass. And on your x-axis, you have stocking date, so when you put your cows onto the pasture, onto your rangeland. And you have mean daily biomass for the entire 30 years of simulation. So this is the mean daily value during the 30 years of grazing. And then the different colored lines represent different intensities of grazing. So as you go from purple to green, purple is heavy grazing and green is light grazing. And so you can see that later stocking date over here slightly increases mean biomass during grazing. And so this makes sense because you're putting your cows later into the season, so you have more biomass left. But now you can also look at the destocking date. So when do you remove your cows? And so here you see destocking date, and again you have your mean daily biomass values on your y-axis. And you can see that grazing intensity really controls biomass at later destocking dates. And so after let's say September 1st, it doesn't really matter when you take off your cows, because for below ground biomass, for example, grazing intensity takes over. And so destocking date really doesn't matter at that point. And so we can look also at grazing effects on above ground biomass in particular. And so for these, we're looking at the years after grazing, which you can consider as more of a recovery period. So you graze for 30 years and you say, how will my rangeland respond to that 30 years of grazing? And so the legend here, dark green represents, the greens represent the destocking date, so earlier to later. Then you have above ground biomass, and then on the x-axis you have years after grazing. And you can see that destocking dates is really a secondary control on biomass recovery at this light grazing intensity. But as you increase grazing intensity, so these are more intense grazing, later destocking dates and higher grazing intensity really reduces the recovery time of above ground biomass. And when I mean recovery time, I mean that when do these different lines meet back with this black solid line? The black solid line represents no grazing. So you're really looking at when will these different lines meet back with this, if at all. And there are some simulations where light grazing is beneficial to the grassland. So you see these green lines above the black line. And so we also want to look at grazing effects of above ground biomass under a future climate. And so we do very simple climate change simulation. So I basically take my daily time series of precipitation and do 40%, minus 40%, 20%, minus 20% of that. And then you can do these very simple simulations. And so with this, you can look at your above ground biomass during your grazing period, again this is 30 years, and then your recovery period 10 years after. So the question you can ask looking at this is, can more rainfall buffer the effects of grazing? And so this black line represents your biomass without any grazing, and then these different color line represents your different changes in precipitation in those simulation responses. And so you can see it might. So this is for a light grazing simulation. You can see that with more precipitation and with grazing, you are above the no grazing simulation, and you are still recovering after the 30 years of grazing. But as you increase your intensity, meaning more biomass is removed, more rainfall may not be able to buffer the effects of grazing. And so the answer is it depends. And so similarly, again, looking at above ground biomass, we can look at changes in temperature, and I'm assuming a warming climate scenario, and I'm just doing additive, simple +1, +2 to +5 Celsius with my time series again. And again, we're looking at a grazing period of 30 years, and again, a recovery period. And for the most part, warmer temperatures have a negative impact on biomass, but in some cases, warmer temperatures can increase growth at lower grazing intensity. So this is for a very low grazing intensity, and you can see at some points here, you can see this orange right here above this black line. But as you increase grazing, they all go below the black line of no grazing simulation. And so what does this all mean? And so really, I guess you'll recognize this Reynolds Creek from the previous talk. So what does this all mean? So really this work helps us to simulate grazing processes at other rangeland sites. So the Reyes model was initially developed for forested systems. So what we're doing is we're adding capability for us to simulate not only grasslands and rangelands, but also management impacts in these areas. We can also test additional grazing strategies. So I only did 30 years. What if we did 20 years or 10 years? Or what if we tested more seasonal impacts of grazing? And then for precipitation and temperature, we can also test the seasonal impacts of those and also look at the combined effects of temperature and precipitation. And finally, we can move on to incorporate spatial heterogeneity, meaning the different aspects of topography, vegetation, soil, and the landscape at the watershed scale. So in conclusion, as I mentioned, this demonstrates a proof of concept for implementing management in a natural ecosystem model. Of course, this was at the short grass step, but you can use this process anywhere, including the Pacific Northwest. And what's important about this model is that we can investigate those competing effects of water, carbon, and nitrogen. It also provides a foundational work for additional site-specific analyses within the general rangeland biome. And we can also present this information to land managers and decision makers so that we can help them with their environmental and economic trade-offs and how they make those decisions on their landscape. And we can look at forage quality, so do you feed your animals now versus a different time? When do you take your cows off your pasture? And we can also ensure that there's economic resilience for long-term sustainability and economic viability. Thank you. Sure.
So you just talked about grass. So
yes.
Are you tracking specific species, or are you just looking at a typical assemblage for that biome? And related to that, are you tracking species shifts? Because overgrazing can cause weed species and that kind of thing.
Exactly, that's a great question, or questions. So I'll take the last part. Species distribution we're not looking at yet. These simulations were done at the point scale. And so for each of these sites, we are looking at a variety of different parameters. So as in the last presentation with Biome BGC, also with Reyes, you can parameterize the model based on species-specific parameters. So for short grass steppe, I am choosing parameters that represent the short grass steppe vegetation. So for all these different sites, I will pick a range or pick particular values that represent that particular vegetation at that site. And then, so what was the first part of your question again?
The other link, because are you just kind of picking an assemblage and just going, is it going to do better or worse? But you're not like showing species shifts.
Not necessarily, no.
You're not picking out three specific
No,
species.
I'm not.
Kind of an assemblage with
At the watershed scale, you can simulate, let's say I have different part of the watershed that represents trees and the bottom part represents shrubs. You can represent their competing water, carbon, nitrogen, but not the species. They're not moving, they're just there.
So you don't have cheap grass invasion in this?
No, that's something one of my committee members asked me about. So soon, maybe.
Have
Sure.
you thought about looking at intensive grazing?
Yes, and so do you mean, when you say intensive grazing, do you mean just more biomass removed from the grassland?
No,
or
it's when you have a lot of cows and you move them through quickly.
So like the savory method?
Right.
Yeah, and so actually this picture is from, they do use the savory method, and so that is something that you could do with this model, because you could essentially, at the plot scale, you could pretend that you're moving from a different plot to another by having so many cows on a particular point, right, then move on to another point. That is something I am considering that I think I'll look at. Yes, sorry.
So this is tied to his question, and maybe it's probably something you can't do, but sort of looking at shifts in functional groups like C4, C3, because they have really different list models as C4 and C4, C3. And I think maybe that's what he's trying to get at too, but that's been a big issue, particularly in the mixed and tall grass prairie kind of shifts in how that's climate change is going to affect that.
No, that's exactly right. And so with this model, we can't, like you said, we can't look at those shifts, especially with C3 and C4, especially in the mixed grass, but we can choose a particular PFT that is more C3 grass and or C4 grass. But what I think is useful for this model, all models are wrong, but some are useful. In terms of for this, why it's useful, is that we are using this ecosystem model that's looking at those competing effects of water, carbon, and nitrogen. And while when we move on to the watershed scale, we can't necessarily look at these species shifts. We can look at the competing interaction maybe between a shrub and a grass on the landscape. So that might be interesting. It might not get at exactly what you guys are looking at, but it can get another problem, maybe cheatgrass versus a more natural grass there, the system. Sure.
So it seems like if you're headed toward with these kind of grazing recovery cycles to go into like different rotation scenarios, which ultimately you would think you would link to ecological and economic outcomes. It would be interesting. I mean, to me, the bottom line would be, because the big debate in grazing is like overgrazing does not optimize value. So like what level optimizes income in the long term?
Exactly.
Sustainably. So is that where this is headed?
That will be a piece of it, looking at the economics. Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. There was another.
I had a question about, so with climate change, and especially with arid and semi-arid environments, there's this variability in precipitation.
That's right.
And so does your model take that into account, or can you model this variability where you get a lot of rain one year and less rain the next year over time?
We can. So because it is a process-based model, so I am using observed time series data, but what's cool with that is that I can take that observed data and do funky things to it. So I did add precipitation, like 20% more, but that's not really realistic, right? So what if I changed more of the seasonal distribution of precipitation? So you can put that into the model and then look at the response. And additionally, we can also look at different climate change data from different models, of course. I just happened to use the time series data because it's readily available and did a simple climate change perturbation. But we can exactly do what you're saying and look at those seasonal changes. That's right, though.
Okay. All right, thank you. We're supposed to have a little bit of a wrap up. I just wanted to note that as an ecosystem modeler, I'm pretty impressed that we just had 4 talks that had models in every single one. I keep pointing out, wouldn't get that at ESA. Maybe at AGU, but then you have to call yourself a biogeochemist, right? So yeah, we had MC2, we had DGBM, LPJ, we even had an empirical model, but you don't name those. And we had Reyes and we have BioMGC. Embedded in MC2 is Century, so you've got the map Century model, which is, so it's a DGBM biogeochemical mix. I think what they were getting at in the back with Reyes, it's kind of what MC2 is. It's sort of this blending of the DGBM species distribution shifts over time, the classified type things, with the biogeochemistry model, so you combine those worlds. Grasslands were a long way away from that, I think. I've used async quite a bit. I have forced it to shift its species-ish thing with some nitrogen deposition experiments and stuff like that. Try to bring in weeds, change the composition, and how the behavior is going to change over time. It was good. Cool session. I didn't even know what was going to be in it, but John asked me like 2 weeks ago to talk or announce people. Anybody else have any closing comments on the whole thing. No, you probably weren't here the whole time. All right, thank you, speakers. Thank you, Arya.